It's the United States government who has a hand in the smallest domino that tips all the way to the future of the ACC and thus the Big 12. And I don't know if that's a good thing. This is Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Wednesday, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Big 12. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. Thank you for making this show your first listen every single day. Joining us today is Immaculate at Immaculate View on Twitter. Maybe the most well-informed expansion, realignment, and even, I'll say it, legislation source out there. Coming to 100%, I'll give it to you. Coming to this guy and having the conversation of the first domino that has really propelled not just, I don't want to call it expansion, but almost realignment, because there are talks of consolidation where we've gone from a Power 5 to a Power 4. A lot of that starts with the United States government and the National Labor Relations Board and whether or not student athletes are paid employees of universities. Now, that's jargon that might not sound that entertaining to you, but what it does is determine the future of the ACC and thus the Big 12. I think the ACC is where we'll find out first how all of this settles out. And Immaculate, from your standpoint, whether it's the Dartmouth case, the USC case, dating back, nearly a decade ago to the Northwestern case, with the idea of student athletes being paid by the university, where is that impact going to go?
Well, with the NLRB, remember, their jurisdiction is due only with private schools. So they have no say over public schools. And to start going back to the 2015 case with Northwestern, that actually passed. They were going to have them become employees, be unionized. It got appealed. The appeal won. And it was largely stated because they were in a conference with state public schools, right, that it would have been uncompetitive for the athletes at those schools to compete against them under a different set of rules. So that one did not pass. And we're right here back in the same situation again with USC. They're even going to the Big Ten, which was literally cited as the reason for why Northwestern won their appeal. So we're having the same argument once again, discussion, debate. The difference is now from then, these students actually have NIL money coming at them. You can almost argue that the situation's better for them. Dartmouth, they lost their case. And the difference there is they're in a conference with only private schools. There's no competition with public schools. So they're hoping to even get their appeal heard. But at this point in time, that may not happen.
With this, the idea originally was, as a private school, paying your student athletes as employees would give you a competitive advantage. That seems to be why Northwestern was left off the table, because then if you can pay somebody, everything's thrown out of whack. If you're the ACC and we find out from the NLRB, hey, fine, this could be a go, is there an advantage then in adding even more private schools and almost becoming a consolidated private school conference?
Maybe, but also remember, it's not just about paying your football players and your basketball players.
That's good.
You're paying your rowers, you're paying your gymnasts, you're paying everybody. You've got to do that across the board, especially if we're still going to be student athletes with Title IX. One of the reasons that becoming employees is a little worrisome is because Title IX does not apply to employees of the university.
Yeah.
So what happens then? There's a lot of kind of fear stories out there we won't get into, but I don't necessarily think it's a benefit. I actually do believe it might be a hindrance for those private schools.
The Big 12, their role in this, it seems to me, and I'll mention it as I did on the top of the show, that the ACC is where we see the true effect of this first.
Yes.
From a Big 12 perspective, how do you judge the future of the ACC and learn from that in making your own decisions moving forward? Because as you've noted off the air, the NLRB decision has a direct impact immediately on where the ACC wants to go.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking at offhand 7, 8, 9 schools that are all private schools that are, either full members or partial members of the ACC. They're going to need to know this stuff before they can make any decisions on the future, on who they might invite to maybe replace schools, on who might want to stay there, who might want to move on, what the ACC is going to become in the future. We'll get into more of other things, but these conferences at some point in time are going to be able to have their own rules. They're going to have to decide on how much they're paying out to students. So you might want to have a conference that's at least a majority of private schools, so that then you as private schools control what those rules are going to be in the future. Versus now, all these conferences are basically public school controlled, and the privates just kind of have to go along.
From the standpoint of the Big 12, and in talking about where private schools go from these rulings, you mentioned again off air, Baylor and TCU, two of the cruxes in this conference, the original 8, and even a BYU has got such a big, expansive fan base. They are private schools themselves. Are those universities, should they be closely watching where these rulings go?
100%. I mean, even though it's just for USC, that's pretty much going to be a ruling for you as well. I mean, that's a precedent. I mean, most of them would probably start to comply with that already. There's a complaint that's been filed on Notre Dame since that happened. So, I mean, they're already moving down the line. Unless we get some type of, I don't know, dare I say, congressional action, and depending upon what happens with that NLRB ruling, that's pretty much going to be over every private school.
Yeah. If you had to guess the final ruling of the NLRB, especially as it sits in 2024, much different than it felt the atmosphere-wise, especially with NIL than it was in 2015, where should this ruling go?
Well, you hear from everyone who talks about this a lot, that it's a slam dunk. It's going to pass.
100%.
I kind of like to push back on that, partly to be contrarian, partly because I tend to believe that this might not pass. These students, you could argue the situation is better for them now than it was in 2014, 2015. They have NIL payments they can get. They can actually get paid now. They couldn't then. So if they're going to remain in that situation, and especially if we're going to have a settlement that does not turn all of these public school students into employees, I think that would make for a very unfair, uncompetitive situation between private schools and public schools in the same conferences. I tend to think that they're not going to pass it. They paused the hearings for 2 months, just stopped them. I don't know if that's normal or not. It seemed a little abnormal to me, especially when they came back for 2 days and then wrapped up. So I think that they were kind of watching the settlement situation.
And that's where we go next. The settlement situation is going to determine across the board, not just private schools, what student athletes stand to gain as employees at universities. This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. eBay Motors is where you go for passion, drive, and excellence. I look out at the back of or the front of my house or whichever and see where my car is, and there is a plastic piece hanging down from my 2016 Nissan Maxima. That plastic piece, I don't know if it is or is not important, but there's a new piece, the same piece, coming in from eBay Motors because I don't like the fact that it's dragging and making a lot of noise and kind of embarrassing when I'm in the Kohl's parking lot. The formula for a winning team is what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors knows exactly what that is. That is a guaranteed fit, quality, patience, and even tangible parts, superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights for speed, power, or style. eBay Motors has got you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You will get what you need with an eBay guaranteed fit that is available to U.S. customers. And it's easy to make your car the MVP. Bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive. ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Again, only available to U.S. customers. It is eBay Motors. Visit ebaymotors.com today. Immaculate, the Big 12 has bought into the settlement. And this settlement is, if not gone through, the NCAA could owe $20+ billion tomorrow. And that probably wouldn't be a very good thing for the NCAA. So settling for $2.7 billion seems to be the future. And what this creates, from my perspective, is something that ESPN has mentioned, this autonomous, and they haven't said it directly, but everybody's got these underlying murmurs that you have put together in the phrase autonomous conferences, meaning the Big Ten, the SEC, namely, can start to make their own rules. The Power Five from now on can say, we want to move forward with this and do this, almost exempt from the NCAA's grasp. Is that where we're going?
Well, to clarify on that, that actually exists already. There's already the autonomous conferences, which were formed in 2014. It's also when the CFP was formed. And when Northwestern case happened. But anyways, that was another big year. But that exists. It's just it exists in a very limited fashion. It's basically over them being able to give some extra money to students. It started back then. It was a fight over, you might remember, like the $2,000 stipends that they wanted to give students. It's actually upwards from now like $3,500 to $5,000. But that's all it can do right now. But it's a very streamlined system. The autonomous conferences, each school has a member, and then the conference has 3 votes in it basically, and they put in student athletes in there so that they have a voice. So there's 3 for each conference and then 1 for each school, and they vote on these things for rules that are within their purview. What I'm suggesting is that that's probably where they go and just expand their governance to full or near full governance, since we're now finding out that that's being slipped in with this settlement offers governance.
This is, in my opinion, almost a redefinition of what autonomous conference is. Then it meant, yes, to a limit, but now it becomes, hey, true autonomy in what you want to do as a league. And Charlie Baker mentioned now, 6 months ago, that what if in the future the SEC and the Big Ten, this elite level of college schools, could make their own decisions in NIL and how they wanted to treat their athletes. Do you believe that's where we're going, where the NCAA almost becomes irrelevant in the top decision making from these power leagues?
Yes and no. To me, the autonomous conferences system is probably the best of both worlds. I know a lot of people say, why don't they just leave the NCAA? It's irrelevant. Well, if you go in and you look at the NCAA rule books and guidebooks and everything they do, and hundreds of pages that it is, there's a lot of stuff that those conferences probably don't want to deal with.
Yeah.
And so this allows them to focus on the stuff that they do want to deal with without having to go through committees and all these other groups that have members of schools on them that are not part of this. Division I now has its own ruling council, but some of that is FCS. So the autonomous conferences, which is now becoming an A4, not an A5. Big 12, they have a say on that. The ACC has a say on that. So it's not just the Big 10 and the SEC. It's all formed together. So however many members you have, guess what? Now that gives you a number of votes. So if a conference becomes much larger than everyone else, technically you're going to have more votes on that board. So go ahead.
And that I don't mean to stop you there, but I do mean to stop you there, because I think everybody's immediately going to turn to, wait a second, did you just say the Big 12 should add as many member schools as possible?
It's not that simple. You still have to pay for them all. You still got to. There's a lot of problems with that. But if they can figure that out, Big 12 pays half to its schools. It might be easier to actually get larger. Technically, yeah. If it becomes that big of a deal, and we may be finding out soon, having a slight voting advantage on there might be helpful.
That goes back to a Bill Connolly radio show a couple of weeks ago where he said the Big 12 will go to 32 before anybody else does. And I was like, all right there, Bill, slow the roll there. I go a little bit extreme there, going a little expansion happy. Immaculate, when it comes to that $20 million number, let's camp out there for a bit. I don't know if Iowa State currently can dole out $20 million, and that has been the rhetoric from their athletic director, who has cut spending for advancements in facilities. He said, look, we can't, we got to stop these projects for the thought we might have to pay $20 million to our student athletes directly. Is that where this settlement's going to take us? And it seems like that is the case. And can every school in the current Power 4 pay for it? And if you can't pay for it, do you just go away?
What I think matters more than a specific number like that is a percentage. There's going to be a percentage ascribed of how much you bring in has to go towards that. So technically in the Big 12, that could be a lower amount than what it is in the SEC or the Big 10. So if a school decides to just go with whatever that minimum is, they could be paying out less. So, you're thinking, we'll never get the right students. Well, you're still paying them, and they still want the opportunity to actually start on a team and play and be seen. So you'll still have opportunities to do that, but you might be able to do it at a lower cost. And I think what we're seeing, especially because the lead counsel for the plaintiffs has said, is conferences are going to be able to determine some of their own rules going forward. Now, he's just a lawyer on the plaintiffs, but I'm sure he probably kind of knows where the settlement's going. So you guys would be able to determine some of that on your own, and maybe the amount that you guys do is a little bit less. Yeah. And so it's a little more feasible.
let's say, and again, I think the general person listening to the show then thinks, all right, well, if the SEC is giving out $21 million a year, each school to its student athletes, and the Big 12 is giving out $14 million, we'll say, then at that point, the disparity in quality of athlete goes from the gap it already is to an even wider one. Does that, in essence, put the Big 12 completely out of the picture from a competitive standpoint with the Power 2 that many have dubbed it?
Best answer I can give on that is I don't know. I mean, we're going to have
That's probably the nice answer. That's the nice answer.
And I would like to say that, no, it's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
Because, it comes down to you're going to have to figure out some ways to be competitive in raising funds.
Yeah.
Also, like I said, this also comes down to opportunities. They're talking about limiting roster spaces for football. So, that might go down. They might not have walk-ons anymore. Right. So some of these guys who maybe would get on to another program at some of these schools, they're only going to have a limited number of spots. So you're still going to get guys. You're still going to, and that comes down then to coaching and putting the team out there. And also in the Big 12, you're going to have a gauntlet throughout the entire year.
I think so.
Anyone who's ever played before, the best way to make guys better is have tough games for them.
Yep.
So you might be surprised at what you can do by paying folks a little bit less, but having, just an across the board, highly competitive league.
You didn't break my spirits like you could have there. There is, and with the roster consolidation, the kid who would have been a 4-star backup for 2 years in an SEC school, who thinks he can start right away at Texas Tech, might choose the Big 12. Yep. And that, in essence, and maybe Big 12 schools put more focus on NIL than the SEC, who might dial back on collectives. That's the hope, at the very least, to keep the Big 12 where it is. Let's take you for, at least now, to the East Coast, where the ACC and Florida State, it seems like the Noles are even more active today, especially behind the scenes, on Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is where I go all of the time, to try to win just a little bit of money. The first of the month's coming up, and I think, I'm just going to go to the NBA, and there's a game going on between the Dallas Mavericks and whoever the Dallas Mavericks are playing, the Timberwolves maybe. Well, FanDuel, there, I can say, hey, guess what? Of these 7 games, I think the Mavericks are going to win in 6, and I put $20 on it. If it hits, I get $75, and $75 is good. If it doesn't hit, I lose that $20, but guess what? If it does hit and I win that $20, I also win $150 in free play. That's right. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet, much less $20. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, and player props and more. FanDuel.com/lockedon to make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com today and bet on the Dallas Mavericks, or if you don't want to, the Timberwolves from Minnesota, if that suits your fancy. For $5, if you hit, you get $150 in bonus bets on FanDuel.com/locked-on. Expansion guru, realignment guru, everything guru, immaculate, joining Locked On Big 12 today. Florida State has called on the Supreme Court in North Carolina now to help in this case against the ACC. Immaculate, I don't even know if we should dive so deep into exactly the lawsuit side of things and more so the activity from Florida State. Does it feel like, with ESPN's decision coming in February of 2025 to extend its contract in the ACC, Florida State is trying to work even faster right now than expected?
I think they're trying to keep up. They had a little bit of a setback in the Florida court. So, the appeal going to the Supreme Court in North Carolina maybe puts a little more time on that situation, because really it kind of looks like a race. I still think in the end that all gets settled in a settlement, but for some reason, like the coinciding races in courts, think of it as positioning or leverage at the settlement table, which I'm not saying they're sitting at, but just kind of in a general sense. The North Carolina Supreme Court did place that case with that court and that judge in particular. I'm not a legal expert. I don't know if that means that then allows them to just immediately appeal to the Supreme Court like they've done. Also, I do believe the Supreme Court could probably then decide to place that elsewhere. But that seems to possibly be the reason why they're then able to appeal directly to the Supreme Court on those, which were basically just judgments on motions. Like, it's not even getting into the main hearing yet.
am I reading into, you and I have talked a bit off the air as well, that if any of this, from settlements to NLRB to Florida State and the ACC, if anything gets to Congress, then we're truly talking how you, as a congressional representative who went to the University of Texas for law school and now represents the state of Texas, you want to be in good graces with Longhorn fans who are voters in the state of Texas. Knowing that there are North Carolina law grads who are a part of that Supreme Court in the state, at what point do we start really looking at collegiate allegiance for personal humans in these conversations?
Oof, that's a tough one because, when you're talking about such a publicly visible case that everyone's paying attention to,
Yep.
I would like to think those folks would be very careful about allowing their personal biases into this. And these are professionals. They've been doing this. So it does, just because they're from a school, it doesn't necessarily mean they're just going to come in and, rule for them.
Right.
But they might look for little subtle ways to help.
Yeah.
I think we've seen that down in Florida, where he basically told them what to put in their complaint that they just refiled. So we'll see how that plays out. I don't know how blatantly they'll be for that, because remember, there's also going to be Wake Forest folks on there, or maybe Duke folks, or North Carolina State folks, or folks from out of state. We don't know. I've seen some of the names that are on there. It's interesting, but I don't want to ascribe anything to those folks. I mean, until we see differently, I would assume that they're going to be professional about this, because there's going to be a spotlight on them on this.
You'd be a great politician. That was a very down the line answer to not put anything on any folks. I think for now, at least, until we see examples of, and we saw it in Florida, as you mentioned, but until we see examples in North Carolina of allegiance to these schools, there can be no blame to place. Yeah. The price tag, though, with Florida State and Clemson and their attempt to exit, I think, to me, and there was a guest on the show last week who said, North Carolina truly is that last domino for the ACC. If they're the ones that decide, hey, we're going to tag team along with Florida State Clemson, we're going to exit, the ACC collapses. Do you think there is that domino that is the true downfall of the conference?
I don't think there's enough spaces everywhere for the conference to have a downfall per se.
Yeah.
I would say it's going to be seriously affected. Now, one thing we maybe haven't taken into account on our what could the price be on exit, we just found out today that the ACC is actually on the hook for more in this settlement than the SEC. So if you're the ACC and you know this, they've known this for a while, they're probably wanting to figure out what's the cost that's going to be involved before you let your biggest draft horses out the door. Because it's kind of being a problem right now for the PAC, because all the schools that just left are actually going to have to be part of the PAC in terms of that, the situation in their payouts. So it's probably just a lot easier to have everyone still be part of the conference when this gets figured out. So I think whatever they're on the hook for, that's also going to be a part of this cost in the end. So that could help out a lot once we have that number.
Do you, and it might be too tough to tell even today, I don't have a guess, so I'm putting you in kind of a corner here. Do you feel as though Florida State and Clemson have momentum to keep that settlement number low and low enough for other schools who want to exit to be able to do the same?
You might want to ask me that one the next time after we seal this.
Right.
There's points to be made on that from both sides.
Yeah.
Good points. So there's a spectrum for the answer. I mean, it could be that they win this thing, they get out. If they get a ruling, the scare is that if they get a ruling in their favor, it doesn't change what the exit fee is, or it doesn't change what the value is. The ruling would be that it's unenforceable, and that means nothing.
Yep.
So, it's going to come down to a negotiation and a settlement, all things involved. I do think that they're probably prepared to make a significant payout in order to get out. But if it really depends upon what the ACC needs to be afterwards.
I'll keep you there too, because it almost seems like there's that, and I think you again mentioned off the air the phrase buying time. Maybe that's the best way to conceptualize it. Why buy time, and are they buying time?
That's what I think. To me, it doesn't. This doesn't go anywhere other than a settlement. But if you don't know entirely what the future is going to be, it's kind of hard to determine, first off, who's going to go, who's going to stay, how much do we charge? Certain schools are not going to be able to pay as much to leave. Right. But if you're trying to redesign the ACC to survive in this future, you might need some more schools to leave than people tend to think you need to keep them all. But if it's going to become a different kind of league, you might need some to leave. So I think that they're buying time for this settlement. They're buying time for the NLRB cases. They need answers. And when they get those, we might see movement. But until then, I think they're basically just paying lawyers to give them more time.
Yep. Is there any way then, I'll leave you here, in the next 2 weeks, we get more clarity on where that conference future is?
I think there's a good chance. I think, we need to know the settlements. We need to know if Congress is acting. We need to know the NLRB case situations. And once we have those answers, it's going to be a lot easier to answer that question in terms of what's going on with the ACC.
I love it. I love that today, Wednesday, May 22nd, we can take the buying time conversation, the almost, I don't want to say nothing burger, but it does feel like there's been this leeway. Florida State's had more action than Clemson in the last month, at the very least, to me. But it isn't this tangible action of, now we know they're really trying to move. In 2 weeks' time, this same conversation looks very different, and that I'm excited about. When we have that conversation, and in the interim, how can folks find your opinions and your takes, Immaculate?
Well, currently they'll find me on X, as you said, Immaculate View, discussing all the situations as it's unfolding, perspective on some of the accounts and reportings as we get them. So right now, that's where I'm at. And to find me, feel free to, take a look for me there. See if maybe you like it, maybe you don't. If you do, feel free, please like what you like. And if you like a lot of it, go ahead and give me a follow and join in the conversation.
Brian, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Absolutely. Love it.
That's Immaculate, at Immaculate View on Twitter. I really don't believe there's somebody who has a more concise collection of news on these topics than that guy right there. This has been, and always will be. Come back tomorrow for even more Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.